Okay, good afternoon. So we'll kick off today. Thank you very much for your time to join us on this webinar. And it's been a bit of a break before from our last webinar. So we've been working hard, and I suppose it's the right time now to give you an update on where we are in terms of the endpoint assessment journey. I'm going to be joined by my colleague Hannah Eldridge, who is one of the EPA delivery managers here within the apprenticeships team in Pearson. And Hannah will actually walk you through an example of the new system that we are going to be talking about a little later. So moving on to our discussion for today. So we are very quickly, we'll do a quick recap on the endpoint assessment offer from Pearson. We will look at our service overview, which we have talked about in some of our previous webinars, but we'll have a quick review on that. We have entered into an exciting partnership with Smart EPA, and we'll talk about that. Really excited about that. And we will then, well, Hannah will then walk us through what the Apprentices endpoint assessment journey looks like on the system with Smart EPA, and that would be done from a provider's perspective, i.e. as a training provider. What does it mean for yourself? Finally, we will look at the timelines for rollout. So obviously we are working with this new system. There are some background additional work that we need to undertake to make it fit for purpose for our specific utilization. And that's what we're working through now. So that means there are some timelines for rollout of that system. So moving on, let's just have a quick recap of endpoint assessment, what they are. So as we all know from the apprenticeship reforms, endpoint assessments are independent synoptic assessments of skills, knowledge, and behaviors that take place at the end of the apprenticeship program to test the apprentices on what they have learned during their apprenticeship program and certify and validate that they are competent to perform the role that they have been recruited for. Endpoint assessments are conducted by independent organizations like ourselves, and there are many others in the market as well. And in order for us to be an endpoint assessment organization for a particular standard, we need to apply, or any organization would need to apply to be on the Education and Skills Funding Agency's ROPA, as we call it, which is the Register of Endpoint Assessment Organization. So what do endpoint assessment organizations do actually? What are they responsible for? We are responsible for designing the assessment instruments. We are responsible for administering and marking the assessments. We need to make sure as an endpoint assessment organization that these assessments are robust, valid, reliable. So if an apprentice is taking an endpoint assessment in London vis-a-vis in Newcastle, the result should be exactly the same, i.e. The quality assurance bit should be valid and replicable if delivered any number of times. We're also responsible for recruiting occupationally competent assessors to deliver those endpoint assessment. And along with all of that, we would be responsible for all the external quality assurance activities and audits, and also ensuring that we return the completed data to the ESFA portal to claim the apprenticeship certificates. So this is probably a slide that some of you might have seen in one of our webinars previously. And this basically outlines Pearson's proposition of the different stages that we have outlined to handhold training providers, employer providers, or indeed employers themselves through to the endpoint assessment stage. And the reason that we've done this is based on experience, first-hand experience of actually delivering endpoint assessments since last year, but also because this is a new reform, and what we are finding from the market is that there is a lot of ambiguity, unsurety about what this endpoint assessment looks like. Least of all, the fact that the endpoint assessment can be a bit daunting and complex, not only for the apprentice, but also the line manager who might be new to the world of apprenticeships. So what we've outlined here is the different EPA stages, the timelines that we recommend the stages are completed at, and the processes that are undertaken at each of that endpoint assessment stage. So we start with the endpoint assessment contract signing, following which we have the EPA planning meeting, which is carried out within 8 weeks of the contract signing, ideally, and within 6 months as a minimum, we recommend from the approximate EPA date. And then we have a series of 3 countdown to EPA meetings, which are essentially touch points with the EPA delivery manager within Pearson and the Apprentices employer organization and their training provider, to walk through the details and the logistics of how and when the endpoint assessment will be delivered. Now, what we're talking about is that particular process through to the gateway stage, which is when the responsibility of carrying out that endpoint assessment then falls within the EPA organization. And the learner then has to do a series of activities in preparation or in terms of taking that endpoint assessment. We are talking about the countdown to EPA stage number 2, specifically today, i.e. the endpoint assessment organization systems that we would be utilizing. And Pearson, as I mentioned, have partnered with Smart Endpoint Assessment, the organization, the product, which is from the organization Smart Apprentices, which some of you might know already. So, talking about our exciting partnership, we are really excited to welcome Smart Apprentices as one of our IT vendors, as one of our suppliers. A lot of you might be familiar with Smart Apprentices already, might be using some of their products already. So Smart Assessor, the e-portfolio software, is the most commonly used. They also have something called the funding apprenticeship system. They have a Smart VLE, which is essentially your test system online. And they have something for the digital CVs as well. We are going to be using SEPA, as we call it, which stands for Smart Endpoint Assessment. And that is a product from Smart Apprentices that has been designed specifically for endpoint assessment. I do know that a number of other endpoint assessment organizations are also using this, not just ourselves. So we thought this was probably one of the better ones in the market. So a really exciting partnership. We call it a partnership because just like any customer relationship management system, such a software needs to be customized and replicated to ensure that an organization's processes are delivered through the system. And so from our perspective and from Smart EPA perspective, we are both learning from each other as to how this is done. And hence, both organizations are very, very clear that this is a partnership where we are both learning and potentially looking at taking this further in terms of this partnership arrangement. So what you can see on the screen there is typically what the Smart Endpoint Assessment Journey looks like. And this is really a very brief snapshot of what the system does, and part of the reason why we decided to go for this external IT system. So the Smart EPA can actually register apprentices on the system. It can create different types of user records. You can create checklists. You can book the endpoint assessment on the system, deliver the endpoint assessment, put the results back into the system as well. And it can also produce the evidence that we require for standardization and for audit compliance. So it's almost like an end-to-end system from start to finish, which can cater to all of your needs for endpoint assessment. So why we have gone in for the system? So just to clarify, from your perspectives as our customers, this is a completely new IT system, and it is external to Pearson. So a lot of you might be using Pearson systems already, such as EOL or QMA. And if you do use them, just let me clarify that this particular system, the Smart EPA, will not be accessed via EOL or QMA. It will be a standalone system. Having said that, there are certain toing and froing of data that happens with our existing system, but you need not know too much into detail about that. As customers, as training providers, you would have access to set up on the system once we have signed the contract with yourself. So I'll walk through the details of that, what that process looks like in a while. But essentially, you will be able to set up your apprentices on the system once you signed a contract with you. You can also have multiple users set up from your organization on the system. That's absolutely possible, possibly recommended as well, and we'll walk through that in more detail. One thing I will mention about the Smart EPA system is that it is very much a new product in the market, as you can imagine, because EPA themselves are very, very new in the apprenticeship landscape. And so SEPA, Smart Apprentices, they are evolving this particular product themselves. And so they're introducing upgrades on a monthly basis, which does mean that there are changes in how the user actually interacts with the system, what the permissions can be from a customer perspective. So just to set expectations with you as a provider, as a customer, you will be getting updates on a regular basis from us, as and when we get the updated version of the system, and we can roll out that updated training through our customer services team as well. So this is not a static system. By no means it will be static, and there will be a lot of changes, but we will make sure that we keep you updated on those on an ongoing basis. So I'll just run through very briefly the process, and then I'll take you through a detailed walkthrough on what the end-to-end process looks like on Smart EPA. As a training provider, this is the current process that we have, which some of you might be familiar with already. So you sign a letter of intent soon after you've signed the contract with the employer. And after you sign the letter of intent, we do recommend signing an endpoint assessment services contract, ideally with 6 months prior to the first EPA date. And then as you sign the EPA services contract, you get a dedicated apprenticeship services manager as well as an EPA delivery manager, who are named individuals within the contract itself. And following that, it's the EPA planning meeting that takes place. Now, while all of this process is what you have been aware of online, there are certain processes which happen in the background with the introduction of the Smart EPA, which I'll just touch upon briefly. So when you sign a letter of intent, there is a super user account created on Smart EPA. When you sign an EPA services contract, that's when the details of the employer get set up at our end from SEPA. And then once you have an EPA planning meeting, post the EPA planning meeting is when you will get access and training on the Smart EPA system. So just to highlight that there is a sense of urgency we are actually recommending in terms of going through that process, so that we can then make sure that we are doing the commensurate actions at our end on the online system for you to be able to having a seamless experience of registering your apprentices and getting to the results bit. So what I will do now is very quickly switch screens to go through an end-to-end process. So let me just, okay, so hopefully what you should be seeing on the screen there is the customer journey on Smart EPA. And I'll just walk you through that very quickly. Let me just increase, right? Okay. So on the left here, you can see the different entities involved. So the top ones are yourselves that we're talking to, training providers or employer providers. I know there are a few NHS organizations as well who are listening in, and some specific employers only. So when I say customer, I'm using it in the generic sense of any employer, training provider, or employer provider who are listening in today. The account services team refers to the account services team within Pearson, typically the people you speak to on the phone for any queries you might have with regards to your qualifications. And then the EPA delivery team is, again, our EPA delivery team within Pearson, RSSs, and then a few templates. So let's just walk through very quickly the process that you would go through from start to finish as a customer. So you've signed letter of intent, as mentioned. Your details get set up on Smart EPA. You sign a contract, the employee details get set up. We have the EPA planning meeting. Once you've had the EPA planning meeting, we will give the access to whoever the named person is, the super user as we call them, on the Smart EPA system. And with that particular email, it's an email that goes out from the system itself, and within that email that you receive, we will recommend you to go through the Smart EPA training on the system itself, which will be delivered by our account services team. So that user training, that customer user training, would give you a brief overview of what are the actions that you need to do in order to register the apprentice on the system, in order to book a particular EPA, and we'll just quickly walk through that with Hannah in a few minutes. And then any queries you might have in terms of how you view the apprentices, how you amend their details, how you update their details, etc., etc. What we are recommending is once you've sort of had that access, we recommend that you register your apprentices on the Smart EPA system. And that can happen anytime between once you've received the access from after the planning meeting to when you have your countdown to EPA, but definitely at least 2 months before the estimated EPA date. And the reason we say that is because there might be portfolios to be submitted online. There might be additional evidence requirements that the apprentice is preparing in preparation for the EPA. It just gives everybody, from a provider's perspective, from an apprentice's perspective, to get set up mentally around the fact that they're actually working towards this endpoint assessment. One thing that we are going to talk about that I just want to highlight here is that when you do register your apprentices on the Smart EPA system, that is when that is the point where the 10% of the EPA price will be charged, and it will be on a monthly invoicing basis. So once you've registered your apprentices on the system, you then go to you would then need to book an EPA. But before you book an EPA, you would need to make sure that any checklist documents that help us to ensure that the gateway has been signed off need to be uploaded on a per apprentice basis. So so just before the time that you book the EPA, you need to complete the checklist documentation. I upload the documentation on Smart EPA, and we will have a checklist for each of the individual standards. So you will know exactly what needs to be completed for which standard. Once you've uploaded your checklist documents, as an EPA organization, we will check those documents and we will need to verify that those documents are correct and they're all completed and uploaded. And if they're not completed, then we would need to send you an email. If they are completed, that's when an assessor is allocated to your apprentice, and the assessor would then communicate with you as an employer to arrange the logistics for the day. Now, I've put in the assessor allocation and the test booking. Now, some of the standards, some of the EPAs have a test, some of them may not have a test. So I'm specifically talking about the standards here which do have a test, and why I have highlighted test as a specific component and called it out specifically is because currently our plan is that the online tests would still be delivered on Pearson systems. However, there is going to be an integration that is currently being worked on by our technology teams between Pearson system and Smart EPA. So from your perspective, from the provider's perspective, all you need to do is to ask for an EPA to be booked. We at our end, our EPA delivery team, would actually book the test online for the apprentice if the standard includes the test as one of the components. Again, the test would be delivered and marked by our delivery team as well. Once the assessor allocation has confirmed, they've sort of worked out the logistics for the EPA day. It might be a professional discussion on an observation for a particular standard. So the actual EPA delivery happens. And then the assessor inputs the EPA results onto the Smart EPA. And once they do that, that is the stage where the 90% of the EPA price will be charged. Now, it might be possible that on inputting the results, overall the apprentice actually passes the EPA first time. Well done, that's great. And at that stage, the Pearson certificate will be issued. Do bear in mind, this is not the apprenticeship certificate that comes directly from the ESFA, but from our systems, we can produce a Pearson certificate to the learner and also simultaneously upload the results on the ESFA portal, which will then help trigger the apprenticeship certificate that comes directly to the employer from the ESFA. For any reason, if a particular component or the overall EPA has not been successfully completed, unfortunately, we will need to reschedule one of the components that needs to be retaken, and that reset would be scheduled by our EPA delivery team again. And in terms of the pricing for that reset, that would be done at the time that reset is booked on the system. So that's a really sort of quick snapshot, whistle-stop tour of what the end-to-end process of endpoint delivery looks like. Let me just switch screens once again, and I will now hand over to Hannah Eldridge, who will quickly walk through an example of how, as a training provider, you can register the apprentices on Smart EPA and also be able to book an EPA for a particular standard. So over to Hannah.
Good afternoon, everyone. So as Rahini said, my name is Hannah Eldridge and I work in the EPA delivery team. I'm just going to go through quickly how to register an apprentice and how to book an EPA. When you log in to SEPA, to register an apprentice, select the Apprentice Management option on the left-hand side. Then press Add an Apprentice. You'll then need to enter all their personal details. If there's a red mark at the left-hand side of any fields, that means that it's a mandatory field. The live system will actually check that the ULN is a viable ULN. This one doesn't, but you have to make sure that you get this one right. So yeah, then just go through, select all your fields. The apprentice needs to be over 16 years old at the time that they start their apprenticeship. We do need them to provide an email address at the moment to enable our assessors to get in touch with them. And we do at the moment also need either one or the other of a landline number or a mobile number. There are other fields that you can complete if you want to, but they're not compulsory. So ethnic origin, national insurance number, any disabilities that the learner might have that we need to be aware of. So after you've done the personal details, you move on to the EPA Details tab. You need to select which employer they are with and the address of that employer. So if you are linked to a number of different employers, make sure that you select the right one and the right address, because that is where we will send our assessor. Training provider, college, that should automatically show your address. Which standard they are completing. The day that they started their apprenticeship, so I'm going to do this one as a retrospective one, so say that they started last year. How long the apprenticeship should last, so this will usually be a minimum of 12 months. The expected day that they should be finishing their apprenticeship, and the expected date of their EPA. It won't let you put in today's dates, it has to be a date in the future. Again, you've got a few more optional fields, their tutor, line management name, how to contact their line manager. You have to enter if they're employer funded or government funded. Again, you can also enter in information like the PO number, your invoice number, and you can also say if they need any reasonable adjustments, so extra time or a scribe or whatever. So once you've completed that, You can either save and close or save a new to register a new apprentice. So once you've created your apprentice and they get to their gateway point, to add in their gateway information and complete the checklist, again go to the apprenticeship management option on the left-hand side, select View Edit Apprentices, and then select your apprentice. So you can, if you have a lot of employers, you can filter by employer, you can filter by the standard, or if you know their status, you can also filter by that. So here's my apprentice that I just registered. So you've got a number of extra options now at the top here. So we can now go into documents, and as they go along, you can upload different evidence for the apprentice to support their different components. So you can update something to do with their portfolio, for example. So that will enable the assessor to go in and access those documents before the learner has their EPA. So before you can book your EPA, you then need to go to the checklist, which is basically the gateway, and just tick that they've met each requirement. You can add documents for evidence. And then once you've ticked all the options and uploaded your evidence, tick signed off by the training provider. You would then save that and a notification would come to my team, and we would then go in and check the documents that you've submitted and sign it off. There's a gremlin in the machine. Sorry, I'm just trying to work out why it's done that. Okay. Okay, well, I can show you how to book an EPA anyway. So I'll just show you what it looks like after we have okayed it from our side. So this one I prepared earlier. So now we got the notification for this learner, and it's been signed off by us, and we've put in the completed date. So until this whole process has been completed, you won't be able to book an EPA for an apprentice. So to book an EPA, on the left-hand side, go to the EPA option, and then click on Allocation Scheduling. First, select your standard. Select which component you wish to book, whereabouts the apprentice is going to take this component, so either at the training provider, at their workplace, or at an assessment centre. Select which employer they're with and the address. Then click on Get Apprentices, and then use the drop down here to select the apprentice that you wish to book the assessment for. Select them, then press Add Apprentice. Then select the date that you wish them to do their apprentice, their component. What time you want the assessor to get there, and what time you want the apprentice to start. Then press Schedule Assessment, and it will match you to an assessor.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. That is great. Sorry about the earlier glitches. We are working on a sandbox environment at the moment, as we mentioned, because we're going through some of the customization that's required for the system. So I think that's why that happened initially. Let us pause there briefly. There might be some questions coming in, so I'm just going to hand over to my colleague Sapna to actually list some of the questions that you might have on the system or otherwise based on what we have talked about so far.
Okay, yeah, so we have a few questions lined up. So going back to the first question, so the first question is, who books the EPA dates?
Right. Okay. So the EPA date would be requested by yourselves. What we would recommend at the moment is, and we'll come to this when we talk about the timelines. So before we actually roll out the system to the market, we will be doing everything in-house just to make sure that we are happy with this way the system works and we are confident this is going to deliver what it wanted to deliver. Once we actually roll out the system to yourself, we will make sure that you are able to request a date. What the system does is it matches the requested date to the availability of the assessors automatically. So it might be that the date that you have requested an EPA component to be carried out on does not match the availability of any of the assessors. And what would happen at that instance is that the next available assessors would get assigned, or you as an administrator would get an email to suggest that there are an alternate date, that you need to select an alternate date. So what we are trying to do at the moment is to minimize those steps involved so that it's a simple process for yourself. But at the moment, yes, you are able to book an EPA date on the system.
Okay, so the next question we have is, who would invigilate the test? Would it be the training provider or the endpoint assessment organization?
That's a good question. So at the moment, what we are recommending is that we have that conversation during the EPA planning meeting, and it really is dependent on what the employer, the apprentice, and the training provider are comfortable with. Obviously, the tests would be carried out online, and if the provider has the access to the EOL system or the QMS system where the test can be administered, then we would recommend that it is undertaken at the provider premises, preferably, and also we are happy for the training provider to invigilate the test as well. We will obviously make sure that we have all the logistics in place for that day. But again, we would be very, very transparent with both the apprentice, the employer, and the training provider, and in terms of how this is going to be carried out. Obviously, because the training provider is already using our systems and they are an approved center, we already have systems and processes in place to ensure that they follow the level of standard that we have in place for conducting or invigilating that particular test.
Okay, so next question. Does the Pearson certification go to the employer or the training provider?
So it depends on what you prefer. We would say that the certificate should go directly to the apprentice themselves, wherever their workplace is. If, for example, you are a provider with hundreds of different apprentices in different locations, and you would want to receive it centrally, absolutely fine. We are able to do that as well.
questions. So the next one is, do you need to upload maths and English certificates for the checklist to be added to book the EPA dates?
So I'll let Hannah answer that question.
Well, we wouldn't necessarily need the certificate, but we would need some kind of evidence to prove that they had passed those or attempted the functional skills.
What I'll just add to there is some of the standards have a stipulation that they have passed a level 2 maths and English, and some of the standards have a requirement that they have attempted a level 2 or a level or a level 2 maths or English. So in either cases, we would want to see the appropriate evidence.
Okay, we'll take one final question, which is, if an assessor is not available for EPA, does this inform into the system?
So by that, I'm assuming that you mean that does the system know automatically if the assessor is not available on that particular day?
So I think what would happen if it can't match you to an assessor, get in touch with our team, and we would sort that out for you.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's all the questions we have for now. So moving on our presentation. So just to recap on the actions that you need to complete as a training provider on Smart EPA. So you can register the apprentices on the system, obviously add them, delete them, amend or view them. You can request an EPA, which is known as booking an EPA essentially. So you need to book an EPA for the apprentices individually, and you also need to book each of the components separately. So it can be a bit of an administrative task. So just bear in mind who you want that task to go to, and hence who should be the registered users on the system. You also, for each of the components that you book, you also need to book the preferred time for each of the component, as Hannah demonstrated. So preferred time for the assessor, preferred time for the apprentice as well, and maybe a bit of a gap in between so that the assessor has time to come in, settle down, and be ready for the apprentice when they are coming in for their assessment. You can also upload the apprentice documentation on SEPA as evidence for the assessor. So things like portfolio, for example, or indeed the showcase element, you are absolutely able to upload the documentation on the same system. You are also need to make sure that you maintain the apprentice details on an ongoing basis. So, for example, if an apprentice sort of does not complete the program, just to make sure that you actually, I think you're not able to delete, you need to deactivate the apprentice on the system. If, for example, their estimated date of endpoint assessment changes, then make sure that you actually update that on the system as well. We will go through all of these things during the training, so it's not that this is just told to you once and forgotten. All of these elements would be going into a training video, and they would be available for our customers who select us as their EPA organization. So coming to the timelines for the Smart EPA rollout, over the period of July, we are working through the customization of the system and all the process mapping. So the process that we actually ran through with you, there's a lot of background work that needs to happen in order for that process to work smoothly at the front end. So that's what we're working on currently, expected to complete in July. From July onwards, we are also going to be moving on to the live system. So what you witnessed Hannah demonstrating was the sandbox environment, but we are in the process of actually migrating to the live system, where we are actually putting in the data that we have for all the apprentices which are in the pipeline, all the details of training providers and employers. During July and a bigger part of the during the summer as well, all of this process would be carried out by Pearson's internal apprenticeship and customer services team. So Hannah is part of that team, and also the extended technology colleagues and the customer services team as well. As I mentioned before, because the Smart EPA is an evolving system, we are awaiting a few critical updates from Smart EPA, and those are expected to come out in July, and that would enhance the functionality of the system in terms of what we can do, what providers can, yourselves can do as well. hence the reason why we're not rolling out now, because it's best to have that upgrade before we actually roll it out to the market. We're planning to create all our customer-facing training videos, manuals, everything that we ran through today, and more in much more detail, much more explicit way by the end of August. And then our rollout in terms of the training element of that particular training would be from September onwards, and that would be led by the customer services team in Manchester, who a lot of you might be familiar with already if you're an existing Pearson customer. And then finally, the day when you actually are able to get into the system and be able to register your apprentices yourself, that would be over September, October this year, where we will then be able to go live on Smart EPA. Till then, what I would say, just going back to that, till September, October, obviously we do have, and some of you might have apprentices who are completing their apprenticeship and are due an EPA in June, July, August. We will still be using the Smart EPA system, but it will just be the Pearson apprenticeship team that will be using that system. So as a customer, you will not be having that visibility of the system. However, we are using the live system in the background, and that's part of our learning and making sure that we are happy and confident that the system does what we want it to do, and it mirrors our processes before we actually roll it out to the market from September, October onwards. So thank you very much for that. Hope that has been useful. I do understand that this is a very quick overview, and I think we would be recording this particular webinar and making the slides available to yourselves later on. And I'll just then now pass back to Sapna to see if there are any additional questions that we need to answer before we complete.
There's just one general question, which is for levy-paying employers, is the EPA receipt charged back to them? Or
Okay, so yeah, so according to the funding guidance, the EPA price cannot exceed 20% of the funding band of that particular standard. I know that we have reviewed our EPA prices, and the majority of our EPA prices are within that 20% funding band. However, if there is a specific standard where our EPA price exceeds the 20%, then that additional fee is what needs to be paid by the employer. The 20% also includes the reset fees. So for example, if a funding band is 27,000, for example, then the maximum EPA price, including our resets, should not exceed 5,400, for example. So the additional payments that the employer might have to do would only be in cases where there are a number of resets that are taken, and if each of those resets are charged at a certain value, that value then exceeds the 20% of the funding band. Sorry, it's a complicated answer, but that's how the funding works, unfortunately.
okay, one final question. So it's the system, the SEPA systems related. Can you only add one apprentice at a time, or is there a bulk upload option?
Yes, there is a bulk upload option. We're currently working on the best format to do that. We're trying to work out a template that makes it as easy as possible. But yes, there will be a bulk upload option.
And we've just got a couple more questions come through. How many apprentices can you register in one go? I think that's similar to the other question. So I think we've answered that, so I'll move on. So I'll read this question now. Let's see if it makes sense to either of you. Does this link with Smart Assessor?
So yeah, I'm assuming, yeah, it does make sense. Thank you, Sapna. So linkages of the Smart EPA system with the Smart Assessor, at the moment, it is not integrated. However, I do know that Smart Apprentices have within their roadmap that to work on this integration. On the top of my head, I will say September 2018, please don't quote me on that, but I think as far as I can remember, September is when they are expecting the integration between Smart Assessor and Smart EPA to take place.
I think that's it for questions.
Thank you, Hannah, for the demonstration. And I know that Hannah and colleagues have been working very hard in the background, so thank you for that as well. Thank you to my colleagues, Sapna and Lauren for hosting today's webinar, and we will post the responses to the questions as well as the slide decks within a week's time. Thank you very much and enjoy the sunny afternoon.